Okay, Tim, I'm all for talking about that. The nuance, I do feel it. I'm trying to narrow down, the last hyperknowledge video was about trying to narrow down what are the relations between concepts. And hopefully I should be able to express that using those relations. So maybe it's worth just going over the list of relations.
Let's maybe present the problem again quickly if we can. I don't know if Felix is up on the issue or not.
I think he is, but sure.
Does the difference between nuance and ambiguity, and I don't remember myself whether we defined one. Yes, exactly. Thank you. Ring a bell to you? Oh, I remember I wrote the meeting notes of that meeting, so let me pull them up actually. Yes, here we are. Share. Yes, in Hangouts. Done. Meeting summary, 29th of October. It sounds like, Timothy, this is what you want to talk about. So we talked about it depends, homonymy, nuance, ambiguity, and general to specific. What does it all mean? It depends. We approached some consensus that differentiating between homonymy and general to specific are important distinctions to make. More concretely, how do you translate IE? In other words, handled differently in a platform. But there's still uncertainty whether or not a meaningful third distinction should be made, which Timothy calls ambiguity, which is claimed to be different from general to specific. That's why we left off.
Yeah, just for the record, IE is id est. It's Latin.
Yeah, but we speak English.
Oh, well, IE is part of English, so I think so is id est.
Because it makes sense.
I mean, English is a patchwork language anyway.
But I guess it is in other words, right? Yeah, that would be the.
Yeah, but you can just say IE word.
Right.
Yeah,
so, yeah.
Which is, it really means which is rather than in other words. Which there's a bit of a distinction. Sorry, I'm being pedant here, but in other words means it's an alternative description, and it has like, okay, I'm going to define it here.
Okay. Then I probably even used it incorrectly here, but yeah, that's not the topic of discussion right now. So can someone paraphrase?
It could be
that consensus to
it depends.
Yeah, what was your question about consensus? What's that?
Can someone paraphrase what we think we agreed on last meeting to Felix, the second bullet point? Like, what is the difference between homonymy and general to specific?
Well, I don't know if that's the agreement, but this is my view on these two because I brought this up. It's if we have a phrase that can be interpreted as two different meanings, there's a case where the abstract meaning over all of them still makes sense. So an example I give is, let's say I speak about climate change. Do I mean climate change with or without including the notion of ocean acidification? It's both are valid definition. And in some cases, I could mean either. If I say climate change will bring, will reduce human population, it would be true in either case. So it don't matter. Whereas if I say our classic example, Paris is nice, there's this is homonymy. There's no way in which I mean both Paris, the city, and Paris Hilton at the same time. I could mean either, but meaning both is an unreasonable interpretation. And that's what I mean by homonymy. I think ambiguity is the same as
let's not go there yet.
Yeah,
so this was, I think, the consensus we approached.
The nuance versus homonymy. Yeah. And we're trying, is there a third notion? Is there a third case?
Exactly.
And we're,
So maybe Timothy, you can highlight or try again why you think that isn't a third case. Because at the end of the last meeting, you were like hedging a bit, I think.
Yeah. And I'm going to go through this again because I'm not, I have to, like, I'm not sure there's a total consensus on, or a total, not total consensus, a total understanding of, you know, what you mean by nuance and homonymy. Homonymy is more obvious. So, but like, you know, I see three cases again. Let me try to get at the three cases, and then we can talk about how they're structured and that sort of thing. But the three cases I would say are homonymy, where they can't same words to mean two, right? There's general to specific, right? And you may be using the same words. You may not be using the same words. The example I always go to is immigration, right? There's immigration and there's illegal immigration or undocumented immigration, right? One is a single word, another is a phrase or a pair of words, and there's definitely a relationship there between them, and there should be a relationship between claims that use them, and that sort of thing. But there's clearly a distinction between the different things, and you know, in colloquial language, even when you're writing something out, you may use the more general wording, and maybe you're intending to use something specific. But if you're actually defining things, the definitions will clearly be different, right? And so that's where general to specific to me works. Now I get to ambiguity, right? And ambiguity is where I would say you have one definition, but you may have multiple interpretations of that definition. And that's the one that I think still exists, but every time I'm trying to come up with an example, the examples I've given for all of those is, oh, it's because the person didn't read the definition. There's an adhering to the definition. You know, the example may be, I can't, like, I want to use
an ambiguous word in a definition. Like,
huh?
if you use the word climate change in a definition, for example, that could work.
Right, climate change. I mean, you could define climate change as a change in climate, world climate, due to human activities, and you've built into that definition that humans are responsible or something, right? Okay, but then somebody could say that well, climate's that's such a hard one that I think Paris, the city was the good one we were talking about, where, you know, there may be edge cases. If you're talking about Paris, the city, maybe you're talking only about the urban center, or maybe you're talking about a larger sprawl. And then there's a difference about whether or not a street exists in Paris, the city. And so there's a debate about that, and I was saying, well, it depends on how you're interpreting Paris, the city. But if you compare that to the definition that you're actually using, it's probably built into that. Although, you know, it's not built into the example of, what do you say, Paris is a city in France with its center located at whatever, and you give the longitude and latitude. The boundaries of your definition do not include the extent of the city. And that, I think, is where I found ambiguity. There's an ambiguity in that definition where we didn't bother to say how far out that city goes. And so you can debate about whether or not that city, that street is in the city. That's what I call ambiguity.
So I think I commented on that at the end of last meeting as well. It sounds like you are calling ambiguity something that can happen when something is too, when you have a general to specific relation where the general one is too general, basically. Like the boundary is not defined and more nuance is needed to resolve the ambiguity.
But yeah, okay.
And I think that falls squarely under nuance. I don't see how this
Exactly.
does not fall under what I call nuance.
Exactly.
It may be nuanced. Yeah.
It's that use case, but it sounds like you want to refer to ambiguity as the once people interpret it differently because
right.
it's not specific enough, you need more nuance, you could say.
But then there are more nuance. Yeah, maybe I don't know your definition of nuance here.
It's true that you're bringing definitions, which is useful. I mean, I was saying, can this phrase be interpreted as this concept or that concept? I'm here supposing that concepts are not necessarily arbitrarily well defined, but much better defined or as much as needed for what you need at any given point. So when I'm saying get the ambiguity, okay, let's take immigration. Actually, I think it's a good example. When you speak about illegal immigration, sometimes people say immigration and they mean legal immigration without saying so, or they mean both legal and illegal without saying so. So that's a case where they could have been more precise in their use of words, but it is a reality that just the word immigration can be interpreted as either of these because it is legitimately meant as either of these. And that's what I call nuance. You were not precise enough. And the same with Paris.
Wait, in that example, right? Yep. There's a question of what is quote unquote needed, right? But there's no ambiguity in terms of what the definition is, where clearly legal definition is included in definition. The person who made the intent, who made the claim may have intended to restrict it to illegal, but it doesn't matter, again, in my view, it doesn't matter their intent. What matters is the definition, and there won't be a debate about whether legal immigration fits under the umbrella of immigration. No, assuming you defined it as, moving from one country to another to live permanently.
Let's assume legal immigration is well defined because it's defined legally, so that's good enough. No, there's no question that legal immigration is immigration. But there is a question, when you say immigration, do you mean legal or do you also include illegal? And that's something I may ask as, can you nuance what usage you mean? And again, in some cases, we don't know. In some cases, it's necessarily one or the other. And in some cases, it doesn't matter. And that's what I call nuance.
Okay, so in other words, it is being more specific.
It is being more specific. It is, yeah. Nuance is about generic to specific, yes. Whereas, well, you could say Paris is generic to specific, like Paris. But the question is the abstract superclass of Paris the city and Paris Hilton is being. It's such a high level of abstraction that it's not a useful one in most cases. Being's called Paris. It's
but what I'm saying is that nuance has to do with general to specific. If you're saying you need more nuance,
it's a synonym. It's literally a synonym. Yeah, I summarize the general to specific. My point is called nuance. We've been using them interchangeably.
Yeah. Okay. So, but ambiguity can be okay or can require, on the edge cases, you resolve it by providing more nuance, or I would, from the CD approach, split it into different claims with more specific definition, right?
One thing I'm unsure about is there a case of nuance, or what I call nuance, where there's a abstract superclass that makes sense, and yet you would, anybody who used it in the abstract sense should be called upon to decide which one. So it's not that the abstract superclass makes no sense, as in Paris Hilton versus Paris the city, but the abstract superclass is rarely useful in debate, and most of the time it's like, okay, which one do you mean? Now, I'm not sure if that's a real case or not.
It is
if
a real
there's-
case, but I think you can only find that out through debates. It's a result
I think-
of the debate.
Let's put it this way, right? You know when you need more nuance, you need to be more specific. When
Exactly.
you have, like we said, the signal we have is totally differing evaluation.
Let's see when he comes back.
Whether or not you guys, okay,
You dropped out. Can you
Yeah, I'm back.
restate the last 30 seconds?
you hear me?
Yep.
I'll try. So what we have is essentially an empirical measure of, or we've conceptualized an empirical measure of when you need more nuance, which is when you start getting arguments that their relevance is on opposite ends of the spectrum. That's an indicator that people are interpreting differently what you're talking about, because the premise is, you know, the conclusion, the relevance to the conclusion of an argument is changing depending on how you think about it. So yeah, so then that would be an indicator you need to break it up. But in a lot of cases, like you said, the ambiguity is something they can live with for the current intent. It's not creating any difference in interpretation of that claim. Right.
Yeah, it's fully context specific. And I think what Michael Tom is asking is, are there cases of general to specific where the general one in no context essentially is a meaningful generalization? And when I said, I think only through debate you can uncover that. If you have all the places where the general statement is used, and in all of those, it's proven to be useless, a specific one is needed, then I guess you can state, well, this statement in any context seems to be not very useful. But I think that's only uncovered by reusing the same claim, the same canonical claim in many different debates.
Yeah. Yeah, so what I'm seeing there is like an asymptote sort of situation where it's like the statement is, you know, the superclass is so vague and so unrelated that no argument makes sense to everybody, right? And so a claim using that is going to be so full of holes. But it depends on the claim, because really, if the superclass
The Earth is round is a good one.
Things, huh?
I think the Earth is round is a perfect example of this. It's a perfectly valid general claim without defining Earth or round.
That is a very good example, because, you know, then people come back with no, because it's got mountains, right?
And it depends fully on the conclusion whether or not this is specific enough or not, right? Like,
right.
why are you using it?
Yeah. Right, exactly. But again, you know, the Earth is round. How are you going to define round? We're assuming you're defining it. First of all, the Earth isn't round. Nobody claims the Earth is round. People claim the Earth is a sphere, right? So you're using the word round as a simpler way to say it's a sphere. And then you get into the more specific definition, you know, how do you want to define sphere? If it's like a three-dimensional object with no flaws and perfectly,
but the point is,
the same radius all the way around in 3 dimensions, then that is a definition, and the Earth is not a sphere, right?
The point is, you only need definitions, and you only need more specificity like that if there is reason for disagreement, if there is need for specificity. You don't always need to go into those details. That's I think a big part of incremental formalization.
What's interesting though about the Earth is a sphere case is, I think the definition may be very clear. You define a sphere as a 3-dimensional object I don't know what you call it, but like it's all the same radius everywhere, right? And you're going to get people arguing that the Earth is a sphere when it clearly isn't, and it's not because of the definition. It's more their, you know, or rather, you're going to get people arguing against it. It's whether you want to be pedantic or not.
No, it's about, is it an exact mathematically correct sphere, or does it approximate a sphere? That's the different levels of specificity.
But what I'm saying is you're going to have, you have a clear definition there, a very clear definition. And you're going to get a difference of opinions on whether arguments are relevant, because
Timothy,
it's whether or not people are being pedantic about the definition.
No, Timothy, it's not about, listen, even with the same definition of sphere, the ambiguity lies in, is it an exact sphere or does it approximate a sphere? And when you say the Earth is a sphere with the addition, the definition attached, as specific as you want to, there will still be lack of specificity in what you mean by is. Exact match or approximates. It's irrelevant, the definition of sphere at this point.
Yeah, I guess so. I guess that makes sense. Interesting. Yeah.
And that's good. That's then you uncover whether or not that matters. In most cases, it won't matter. That's not where the
But then
disagreement
you get, yeah, according to our use of definitions, right? We're going to have the now I forgot all the names that we had. The distinguishing claims. Are the distinguishing claims the ones that create the boundaries of the definition?
I forgot. Second one.
That's what.
Yes.
Okay.
Yes. For me,
and then the examples, right? Like, what is it like? The examples. I don't know if there's a name for that. That I forgot if we have that. But a basketball is not a sphere, right? If that's in there, a basketball is not a sphere because of the definition of sphere. It's implied, even though it's not clearly stated, that you're looking for an exact sphere, which is an interesting problem.
Yeah, so you're not defining sphere, you're defining something being a sphere at that point.
Aye.
Well,
And that's also why I don't really, you know, I'm hesitant to place too much emphasis on definitions. For me, the relationship from general to specific on the first case should be on the claim level. And yes, it might make sense to do so through definitions, but I would still always also draw a relation from general to specific between claims.
Are you, yeah, sphere and perfect sphere. Sorry, I got a bit distracted for a second, but there's something that bothers me here. But you're right. I mean, the question is, if I say the Earth is a sphere and I say no because it's not a perfect sphere, is a perfect sphere, that means we're kind of recasting the meaning of the Earth is a sphere to the Earth is close to a sphere. It's not that we're redefining perfect sphere, is that we're redefining the target. Yeah, and this is something I'm getting to in my last I was getting to in my last seminar. I'm trying to define, like, if you look at the formalization process, we're saying ideally we'd like to make to identify the schema of the claim. And the schema of the claim, I said, well, basically it's a frame, and the frame is, like, for example, here it would be the has shape frame, and there's an entity and there's a shape. And I'm saying each of those roles in the frame defines, if you will, a variable. It defines a approximate entity. And then you're using more context to say, to constrain, okay, this entity is the same as that entity in this other frame, is the same as that entity in this other frame. So I can use all those claims represented by each of those frames, or interpreted as each of those frames, apply to that entity, and the entity is kind of the intersection of all those constraints from all those claims. So if I say the Earth is round and it's interpreted as a shape frame, yada, 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 and then I say no because it's not a perfect frame, here I'm creating a context where I'm binding to a certain definition of shape, which is strict. And when you're saying, well, I didn't mean a perfect sphere, then you're rebinding and you're creating another context where you're binding the same entity to a different value, which is approximate sphere. And I'm not going to say which one is specific or generic, but I guess approximate sphere and perfect sphere are both kinds of spheres. And sphere is the abstract superclass of that, or ambiguous class of that. But what I'm saying is there's a conflict in what extra constraints you're imposing to the variable entity by pushing certain more precise interpretations of the concepts involved.
Well, and like I said, that's one way. Having a more precise concept is one way. You can also have the has-shape relation be less or more precise.
Interesting. That's absolutely valid.
That's why there's no one way to model these things, even if you formalize it.
Probably. I basically agree with that. I'm thinking which one is natural, because I do, no, it's a good question, because is there a way to, I don't think there's ever going to be a canonical way, but is there a way to
For me, the natural one would be to specify where there is disagreement. You don't disagree on sphere. Why recast and like say approximate sphere?
You're right.
For me, it makes more sense to recast the has shape. I didn't mean has an exact shape. That's essentially what you're making more specific.
And I tend to agree, because let's face it, in language, we would use an adverb. That means we're qualifying the frame and not the shape. Though we can use either in language, right? You can say the Earth has a shape, is approximately a sphere, and that's an adverb. Or you can say the Earth is an approximate sphere, and that's an adjective.
But so to get back to my point, regardless of how you model it, in both cases, if that is being used in a claim, it's still the case that one claim is more specific than the other claim, regardless of how you model it. So that's why I also want to prioritize that relationship over how you formalize that. Because the more general claim and the more specific claim might be modeled differently, but the relation between the two will stay the same.
Mm-hmm.
That's why I prioritize that, because it's a primary use case. Even though I fully agree, formalizing it more makes sense.
No, there I agree with you. What's important is the relation. The relation is, and this is interesting. Can we define the relation between the Earth approximately has the shape of a sphere, or the Earth has the shape of an approximate sphere? What is the relation between those two? No, seriously.
I would say duplicates. That's for me where I would say this is a duplicate of the other one.
Yeah, probably. And that requires human intelligence, because I don't think there's any way to get this otherwise.
I mean, for humans, it's the same, but probably not precisely for machines.
Well, if you formalize, if you have equivalence classes and you formalize it as such, from then on for machines, it's also the same.
Yeah, it might be. Yeah, true.
The question is that a wrong assumption? But I think we deviate. It's an interesting sidetrack, but maybe we can go back to the main point, which I forgot for a second.
I think it's an important sidetrack. But no,
I acknowledge it most definitely.
No, it's very important. Very important. It's good food for thought. I mean, I would want both kinds of relationships, and I'm thinking that the relationship, well, there's an implicit relationship between definitions, which is shared definitional claims. And yet you make good points that we probably need humans to be able to say, no, they don't share the same definitional distinguishing claims, but they are the same concept nevertheless. And the same thing with between claims. But getting back to the original question, do we have three different things going on, right? There's ambiguity, I define as something, a definition that is something that's fully defined, and yet there are misunderstandings.
I'm going to interrupt you here because it might be part of the confusion. You keep saying fully defined. Whereas Mike Antoine and I, we both recognize something is never fully defined. Something never being fully defined means you can always find more specifics of what you call specifics. When you attach a definition to a claim to make it more specific, it doesn't mean that's the end of it. And from then on, it's fully defined. Even then, you can be more specific, even about the definition.
Are you saying that claims can be changed?
No, I'm saying that if you have a general claim, and then you create a more specific claim which defines something within the original claim that's more specific, because at that point, the definition makes it more specific what was meant in the more general.
And then what I'm saying is the general claim was fully defined, and you created a more specific claim that is also fully defined, and there's a relationship between them. And that's what I mean by fully defined.
By fully defined. Okay. So yeah. So okay, but then something that's fully defined can be ambiguous according to that.
Yes.
Okay.
Correct.
Gotcha.
Right. And so that's what I'm saying is that there's ambiguity. That's that. Then there's providing more nuance, which is general to specific. And then there's the third type was kind of homonyms, which are things that use the same word but are different meanings. And I don't know if that's a separate thing as opposed to just being ambiguous, I guess. Is ambiguity different from homonymity, homonologous, or whatever? I'm the one who speaks English here, and I have no idea what to say. But yeah, that's a question. Maybe the super abstract version is just super ambiguous, and it's not any different from any other case of ambiguity. That's kind of how I see it. I don't see any.
Yeah, I think we went back and forth a bit on, like, if you're talking about whether or not homonymy and
one thing. Sorry, can I approach this from a slightly different angle?
Yeah.
I've been wondering whether these relations are fully encompassed by the combination of subclass and interpretable. So basically, if you say this phrase is interpretable as this concept, and this concept is a subclass of this other concept. So in a way, in the case of, say, Paris, and we're a bit unsure about the, we'd have Paris, say, intramuros, and Paris greater urban area, for example. Those are two well-defined concepts. And Paris is interpretable as either of them, but it's also interpretable as the erasure of that distinction, right? And the abstraction, really. The abstraction of those two concepts through erasing that distinction, which is Paris, either intramuros or greater urban area. And here, Paris, the phrase, is interpretable as any of those concepts, and that's the case of homonymy, whereas in the case of Paris Hilton, there would not be the abstraction concept because there's no, there wouldn't be an erasure. Now, between those two relations, I think we have most of what is needed for the distinction. And then the real question is, there are kind of ontological axes of distinction, which are, you know, Paris is a city is an urban agglomeration, stuff like that. And it's clearly not needed for the kind of abstraction I'm talking about, that is the erasure of that specific distinction, to fit in an ontology, but it does fit in a kind of
Topology.
well, yeah, well, in a way, yes. It's the I keep speaking about feature analysis, right? It is a meet in the feature analysis lattice, and it's
and that's where I think of it as sets and subsets, set logic of distinguishing claims.
Yeah, exactly, exactly. And for me, a distinguishing claim should always not only say this is the claim that distinguishes this, but say what is it distinguishing it from? That is, what is the abstraction that is of which this distinction is an erasure of?
I mean, if you get that automatically if you remove the distinguishing claim, then you have the set.
Not automatically.
That's interesting side note here. That's why I intended to implement this context tags, like flashback to a year ago or something, where the distinguishing claims for me are essentially the context tags you add. When you make a claim more specific, you add a context tag. And if you want to make it more general, you remove them. But just quick.
I'm saying it's not natural because there's no, many concepts have many superclasses along many axes, and it's not like when you erase one claim, yes, in a lattice you see, you define the erasure of that claim, but I'm saying there's many ontology superclasses, or maybe there's only one and it's not the one that you reach by erasing the distinction. You want to reach by erasing the distinction.
Yeah, but then it's a question of
it's lattice versus tree. The lattice is richer than the tree is what I'm saying.
No, I understand. So in other words, an ontology is a tree that highlights a certain part of the lattice. I get it.
Exactly.
Right? Depending on what you erase, you're traversing of the tree or not. You went sideways. Yeah.
Exactly. That's what I'm saying. Yes.
I got it. Yeah. Damn, I had a thought prior to this. No, I can't remember.
You shortly mentioned homonymy.
Oh yeah. Well, one thought was just, it seems to me homonymy is related to interpretation, and tell me if I'm wrong about this. The way I'm understanding interpretation is a connection between a concept, or what we're calling
a phrase and a concept,
whatever. Yeah, and well, you're saying a frame. I'm saying
a phrase.
Oh, a phrase. Okay, yeah, what you call a symbol, right? Yeah. It's connecting a symbol to a concept. Okay.
Yeah.
And so you get homonymy when you have a phrase and you can connect it to two different concepts.
Yeah. And that there's no and moreover,
I think I define it. There's no more common root than the shared identifier. That's
or if there is one, it is totally outside
of
the interpretations of the phrase.
Exactly.
But yeah, so that's homonymy. That's not ambiguity. Ambiguity is
when the meat of the two concepts is included in the interpretations of the phrase.
Right. Okay.
Which, according to that definition, can be good or bad. depending on context.
Right.
Which could be perfectly valid. Yeah.
So that then if we all agree on this, it sounds like it's just a matter of naming these things final and sticking to some terminology, but it sounds like we all agree on these concepts and even a lot of the implementation details, actually.
That's pretty amazing. That's pretty amazing, pretty cool. I'm really happy with this. Although I'm not going to be happy trying to see implementations and design user interfaces and, you know, making it work. And I don't know how this is going to be efficient, but it seems to me the best solution we've come up with, or anyone has come up with that I know of for this sort of thing.
Yeah, and there's
And
edge
very-
cases like,
yeah.
do you need distinguishing claims or not? Are these optional? But that's like, I think we can flesh that out through.
Yeah. Wow. All right, I guess I'm done with this topic for today. Does anybody else have anything to add or anything new they want to talk about? Felix, are you 100% like with us on this, or?
Nothing against it. Like, I have to run it through my head, but like, sounds good to me. Yeah.
It sounds like we should put it in the glossary.
Yeah, or maybe write it down now while it's still fresh in our heads.
Yeah,
That's what I'm trying to say. Yes.
If you could write down the summary of this microphone, because I think
I
the
can.
glossary process is a bit slower on purpose. So it's better now to have
Sure.
a write-up that we informally agree on, and then we can try to finalize the actual terminology. But we don't want to lose what we achieved.
I'll do that right now.
And I would throw out, maybe this is all a separate domain from the canonical debate, but I absolutely agree that the canonical debate depends on it. Right? If it's a separate layer, it's underneath the canonical debate.
I think for me, it's part of the central layer, because it's through general to specific, through nuance, that you can essentially uncover the best suggestions on where to focus discussions on. And if that's a second layer, I mean, it doesn't. We need to consider user stories to see whether or not it's. My intuition is telling me it's a base layer.
Yeah, I think it's what you would call base layer. The question is whether or not it's below base layer.
Well, for me,
because-
there's nothing below base layer.
Well, I mean, but for Marc-Antoine, there might be. And the question is, does Marc-Antoine need claim structures as part of his base layer, right? Are there things that you would do with all of this that doesn't require claims, or is it a
The knowledge
circular
representation,
tendency?
essentially.
Yeah.
Well, I'm see, for example, I keep saying I don't. Let's not use claims, but let's use adjectives because it applies equally to entities, right? So yeah, for me, my base layer is topics, but this whole symbols are related to concepts is at the topic level. It's not the fact that some of the topics are entities and some are claims. And what I'm struggling with right now is and I'm struggling with, and less, frankly, I'm resolving it. Are variables, these kind of frame variables, something else, or are all topics frame variables finally? And I'm more and more going in that direction. All topics are frame variables in that as we connect them to other claims about the same thing, we're narrowing down the meaning. Now, if we want to see them less contextual and more in the abstract, as CDL wants to do, it means the only connections will be the definition connections, but it's still true. We have the defining claims and the distinguishing claims, which are probably the same. narrowing down the meaning of each concept, again, whether claim or entity. And that way, each concept is a variable whose meaning is kind of, there exists an X such that this condition and that condition and that condition and that condition, right? This part of the definition and this part of the definition. So they're variables, and the frames themselves can be variables, and that is reinforced by what Stephen said about putting the imprecision on the frame rather than the shape. Very good example. So yeah, that's more fundamental to me than the claim argument structure. It's the but it's one level below. Is that, I don't know what you call the base layer, if it,
For me,
I think
why
they're
I don't
both in what you call the
below
base
it,
layer.
because for me it's composition, right? If the base layer is designed for argumentation, but this is an architectural discussion now. The whole system for me of the base layer is focusing on centralizing all of different arguments and potential disagreements of many different sources and centralizing that. You can do that by using incremental formalization, but for me, the base layer uses incremental formalization and might use frames, etc., to do so. I don't see it beneath. I see it as like using, as you append formalizations to stuff that's defined in the base layer when you need incremental formalization. That's how I see the relationship.
Okay. This is important. I'm not speaking about incremental formalization here at all. I'm not, the fact that I'm speaking about concepts and, see, we said, what are the important relationship between, you said between claims, I would say claims or entities, between concepts, right? There's the distinction relationship, the equivalence relationship, because sometimes it's not trivial and it's not automated. There's the the distinction creates a subclass or generic specific by itself. There's the interpretation relationship, which relates concept to symbols. Those are the fundamental relationships between concepts. And this has
but there's
nothing...
also constraints on top of it. So I agree, we talked about this. You can also indeed build what I would call a base layer on top of hyperknowledge, but then hyperknowledge in that case would be like the data storage model, but it's still the purpose of the base layer to apply constraints, like, because you don't want equivalence clauses between all different types of entities, etc. There's some constraints there, and I think those are domain specific.
I agree. But what I'm saying is, yeah, when I'm introducing this base layer, which has the notion of interpretation, equivalence, distinction as the kind of...
It's a common data model. That's how I understand it.
It's not just storage. I mean, you say storage and architecture. No. It's a conceptual way to deal with information. It's a slightly different than OL in the way it considers classes in some ways, right? It's close to OL, but it's not OL. And yeah,
but it can store any information, right? So then the question is, a system using that any information, how can it interpret? How does it know what is an argument, what isn't an argument?
Yeah, I agree. The claim argument is a layer above that, totally. And in that sense, it's a, but the whole canonicalization, though it would build on this data model, the meta model, data meta model, I'd like to call it, it would be distinct from it also. And that way it's not the progressive formalization layer, which uses the canonicalization layer through progressive formalization, is not identical to this base model, though it reuses the same concepts.
Maybe, I'm not certain I fully got that. But either way, this is highly, if we talk concrete, this is one of the cases where if you would concrete sketch, like this is how I would implement it in code, it's going to be a much more meaningful discussion than deciding which layer sits above or below, because above and below is highly ambiguous in architecture designs. It depends what.
True.
It doesn't matter.
So it's layers are one-way dependencies, right?
But actually, in this case, saying that it's a one-way dependency is indeed a better case. I would argue indeed that there's a one-way dependency from what I would call the base layer to something like hyperknowledge, exactly. Just like there's a one-way dependency from circular trees to whatever database I use, exactly. That's maybe a better way
the only question I have about that is it seems like the knowledge layer, the underlying knowledge layer, needs debate for part of its process of negotiating the knowledge, right? You know, but maybe that's done outside that layer and that somehow impacts that layer. I mean, like a lot of the things like people talk about the base layer needs comments, and I don't think so. I disagree. I see comments and discussing certain things as happening in a system outside, and then people come back in and make it happen inside the thing rather than having to build that in as well. You know, maybe that's how you see debating about definitions and things like that as being in a higher layer, but somehow impacts the lower layer. Or if you need the actual debate structures to negotiate definitions and so forth.
Maybe we do.
Interpretations, yeah, as part of the same layer. That's really the question for me. In that case, it becomes a circular dependency. It's kind of a question for Macan Flon.
Sorry, I was trying to write the apologies.
Yeah. I mean, we could talk about it another time. It's just it goes back to again whether there's a cyclical dependency, because I understand that the process of the knowledge layer concepts and topic layer involves debating the definitions and debating relationships between things and all of that, right? And so there is at least functionally a circular dependency. But what I was saying is, like, for example, people want to put comments into the base layer, and I don't want comments to be there. I'd rather have comments happen on a website or something, and then people come into the base layer and take actions based on those comments. So that would be kind of an interdependency that isn't interdependent. And I don't know how you see that for the topic layer of needing the debates to be part of that layer, or having it okay being in a higher layer and impacting the lower layer somehow.
Okay, good question. In this, I don't think of it in layer terms, because I think of it in terms of metaclaims. These metaclaims, are they another layer? Maybe, maybe not, but they're certainly, we know they're metaclaims. We know that they're claims about the claims. That's how I distinguish them.
But how?
Well, but that's at the claim level, but at the topic level, interpretation and that sort of thing, you can debate an interpretation. So it's not a meta claim; it's a claim about an interpretation. So it's meta.
It's still a meta claim in the sense that
it's still a meta claim, but so the meta claim depends on the claim layer, right? But does
yes. Okay, good point. It's true that there is. I've been railing against it in the RDF level, but I probably need the distinction between a quoted and asserted claim at the or statement. Let me put it at the statement level before we're getting into claims and arguments, because each frame in the root layer, let's call it the root layer, is a kind of statement, and I need the distinction between, is this statement asserted or is this statement just posited or quoted so that we can discuss, is this true? And this would be, I think that you're right, there has to be a kind of notion of this has been just quoted, and then we can discuss, do we take this as true in this context, which can happen at the metaclaim level, but has to be at the very root layer of saying, this is now considered asserted or retracted or whatever, right? There has to be a way to say these statements about definition, about this supersedes that, is now accepted in this context. It's first posited and now it's asserted in this context. So the notion of asserted versus quoted will have to be part of the root layer.
Not necessarily. I mean, it could perfectly be metadata based on which you can then query the database differently.
That's absolutely true. Well, the way I'm solving this in hyperknowledge, and I think there we're getting into more implementation specific finally, is create kind of scopes and say that whether a claim is asserted is scope specific. And even for media interpretations are scope specific. And certainly the refinements or redefinitions are scope specific. And so a scope will say, okay, this is what I'm asserting in this scope. And a scope may inherit another scope and import things from yet a scope which it does not inherit from, or refer to it, and then it's just quoted. But that's an implementation. There we get into implementation.
Yeah, and to understand those, at some point we need user stories that say, as something I want to add an entity to a knowledge repository, so that, and that my question there is, for me, all of these I can somewhat fill in, but it would be, as a developer of a claim repository, I want to add an entity to a knowledge database so that I can store claims inside easily queryable. For me, they will all look like that. But if you can highlight how this has a more direct user perspective. I mean, I see developers as users. That's totally valid.
Yeah. I understand.
Because that's why I'm still not certain how you see the overlap, or why you argue that it's the same system. Because for me, I see them clearly as distinct systems, and I would, categorize it as a database.
What is a distinct system?
Hyperknowledge, I would classify as a knowledge database, and then a claim repository would use a knowledge database to represent claims. But like the types of entities you can add to the knowledge database and the constraints of relations between different types of entities, and even user interface concerns and all these things, they will be constrained by the consuming system, in this case, what I call the claim repository.
Right. I see why you're calling it a database. I certainly don't see it as a database, but that's another story. For me, I emphasize more the protocol than the database, but of course I'll need a database reference.
The protocol?
Yeah. For me, it's a way to be able to speak about entities across system boundaries.
But that's why I need to hear user stories that are, as a user of this system, I want to add this to this hyperknowledge, so that a user of another system, and that's why I get lost. I can't imagine them, because all of these use cases, in my opinion, will rely on concrete constraints that are enforced by the specific systems. Like,
I see what you're saying.
It's a highly abstract, ambiguous entity or whatever you add to hyperknowledge. To which degree are these useful? And the minimum use cases will be so that you can add links, obviously, right? If you build on top of the same, then there is the link, but it doesn't really explain what the user stories for those links. So you can visit them, but then, what do? I just, why do I want to visit them? It doesn't really answer that.
Yeah, well, so that you, I think kind of publish subscribe will be an important use case. You have an entity in your system, it corresponds to an entity in another system. You want to see what's happening to that entity in that system, so that you get.
I can buy that. In that sense, it's a bit like the CDL white paper, the what did you call it, Timothy? Your definition repository, whatever. In that sense, it could act as an ontology, essentially, you link to. Well, or lattice, sorry.
Yes.
Yeah, okay, that's probably a valid use case. Then you can see, oh, there are so many systems, but you don't know what the systems are, right? That's a problem. The systems could be a paper that links to it could be a website.
Correct.
It could be a, so at most you can probably get some general notion of how popular it is, how active is it, you could probably envision.
No, but
stuff like that.
some of them may have, like the CDL, evolving definitions, and in which case you want to be up to date with those evolving definitions. Wikipedia, that's a system.
That's an interesting use case. The one we actually said before, like how can you see whether it's a useful abstraction, a useful generalization? That could be something you can maybe determine on such a general base layer. That might be a valid use case. If you have the general to specific layer, which seems to be general enough. Yeah, that could be true. And actually, we should write that one down so we don't forget. I'll add it to the list. I'll give it a step.
All right, I have to get going.
Yeah, let's call it a day. I'll finish the write-up and post it, and I'm sure it'll be too abstract, and you'll tell me
try to use
the
terminology we landed on, which was homonymy. General to specific, I think, is as most consensus. And ambiguity. Okay. See you tomorrow, I think. I'll let you know if I can't make it. Bye.
See you. Bye.
Ciao, ciao.